David, I was trying to remember if Schoolhouse Rock had sort of the civics lesson about the three elements of the U.S. government. Do you remember?
I can't remember that one. I know they've done something on the Supreme Court. I think that's probably where you're going, but I can't remember exactly one that they did. They really did like to do Capitol Hill more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, we all know I'm just a bill, and we'll get to that last. I was thinking maybe we just sort of work our way through the three branches, go judicial, then executive, and then legislative. What do you think?
That sounds good. That sounds good, especially because it's this time of year for our listeners, which means the Supreme Court finishes it up before the 4th of July and leaves us with lots of goodies.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of amazing when you sort of think of it in a historical context, how much happens around the 4th of July. So you're right. The court starts the first Monday of in October. The session goes through into the late spring, and then they start issuing their decisions. They usually finish up by the end of June. And so one of their last decisions was in the case of Students for Fair Admissions versus essentially Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. And as I understand it, those two sort of cases got wrapped together into one decision. Do you want to sort of start there?
Let's start there. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna just do a little overview and then ask you for your opinions as because I know you've been working on this a whole lot in your capacity as the lead head staff person for ASN, along with ASN's president, Dr. Michelle Josephson. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm curious as to your sort of initial thoughts.
Well, initially, what you have is you have a situation with Students for Fair Administration versus president and fellows of Harvard College. And then that also includes North Carolina, as you said. And basically, there's been a lot of discussion of this decision. And the decision, it has a very kind of, in my opinion, it has a very kind of superficial read to it. If you read the majority decision, which is basically, we shouldn't be making race an important issue. We should be colorblind, and therefore we're going to make it colorblind, and we're just going to make sure that race is not allowed to be used in the process of admissions. Sounds kind of simple, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I think it was interesting to sort of dig into both the Chief Justice's decision. He wrote the decision, and then the concurrent decisions from the 6 justices who agreed with him, and then to sort of go through the 3 dissents. But kind of curious as to, from a perspective of nephrology, what jumped out at you.
Well, what I said was it was simple in reading it on face value, which is far from simple when it gets into it. And nephrology is very much more closely aligned with this issue than a lot of other, maybe not a lot of other, but nephrology is very closely aligned with this subject. As we know, kidney diseases disproportionately hit people of color, particularly Black people in the United States, and are much more likely to proceed all the way to end-stage renal disease. And when you look at what has happened in our society with people with kidney diseases and how it so skews in a lot of different ways, it's kind of something that you want to see. You want to see, a medical team, a healthcare team that really does look and feel like somebody you could trust and you could hear from. And I think that that's one of the things that medical schools have been trying very hard to do. In the statement that you wrote, I think, you pointed out that the number from 1970 to 1970 to 2022, from 1970 to 2020, U.S. medical school graduates who are Black did not change significantly, went from 2.8% to 6.2%, but women went from 8.4% to 49.6%. So kind of what were you thinking as you were looking at some of these numbers and working on the statement?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues. I mean, one is that the challenges that academic medicine has had in terms of becoming more diverse and inclusive and equitable. And, there's obviously a set of issues there and a number of challenges. I think when you dig into the data, as you note, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of women who are now in medical schools. The first The last medical school to become co-ed was in 1961, which was the same year that President Kennedy coined the term affirmative action. So kind of gives you a sense as to that this was not too long ago, but there was incredible progress in terms of women in medicine. Now, I think there's a separate set of challenges there in terms of leadership roles and pay and true equity, but there is now at least more of a, the majority now of medical students are female. I think that's one issue. I think when you dig into the data around particularly Black Americans, what you see is a percentage, it hasn't increased dramatically. Obviously, there are more medical students now than there were in the 70s, but the percentage hasn't increased, as you mentioned. Where it's been particularly challenging has been Black male physicians. So the growth has been concomitant with the growth of women in medicine in terms of Black women coming into medicine, but not Black men. So that is a sort of secondary issue that needs to be explored. And we've been working ASN with other members of the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, with the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medicine on something called Equity Matters. And this has been one of the issues that group has tried to dig into. So there's so many issues here. And I think my concern is that the discussion around SFFA versus Harvard and UNC has sort of focused, it sort of refocused the attention away from what is best from a nephrology perspective, what is best for people with kidney diseases, how do we ensure they have access to a high quality system, how do we ensure that they have access to high quality care. And I'm hoping we can get back to that discussion as we think through sort of what's likely to happen in the future in terms of, as we look at the U.S. educational system, starting with elementary to middle school to high school into the colleges, and then that is sort of the entry point into medical school. So there's just so many issues here that we're going to have to sort through over the next couple of years, and it'll be really interesting to see sort of how organized medicine responds to this decision.
It sounds like ASN has really just made a commitment for the long term in terms of diversity of health professionals, including nephrologists, and also to that group of patients that is disproportionately affected by kidney diseases. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I would perhaps frame it differently, which is I think ASN's number one value is to do everything possible to ensure high quality care for the millions of people with kidney diseases, kidney failure, and kidney transplants. That drives everything we do. And there's mounting data that a diverse team that, if your health professional has a similar life experience to yours, you're going to be more willing to listen to them, follow their advice, trust them, again, resulting in higher quality care. So you have higher functioning teams, you have higher quality care, and you also have more likelihood that you're going to improve in terms of therapies, the pipeline for drugs, devices, and biologics. Everything sort of aligns with making sure that the healthcare system is as diverse, inclusive, and equitable as possible. And then there's a whole set of issues that we never talk about. There's a whole set of issues that we need to talk more about around healthcare justice and thinking about social determinants of health in ways that we can improve education, housing, transportation that will result in improvements in care. So that's where ASN sits, and we're not alone in that. But I am really proud that the organization has been a leader in this arena, and I don't see. I'm proud of the fact that ASN's been a leader in this arena, and I look forward that we'll continue to provide that leadership moving forward and navigate through this really difficult time as we're trying to incorporate some of these decisions and some of these policy changes into what we do at a policy level.
Well, that was really well said, Todd. I do appreciate what you said there, and I think it really captured so much of what makes us all proud to be a part of ASN. It also makes me think that that kind of takes us to the next level, which is over in the regulatory space. We did just file comments exactly on an electronic quality measure that would be reported for hospitals that may be used in other systems as well, around capturing various things around social determinants of health, including housing insecurity, food insecurity, utility insecurity, and transportation insecurity. And then we are also beginning just to look at the whole PPS QIP proposed ESRD rules. So should we go there?
Yeah, I think we should. And I'm curious too, because I know Lauren, who's our producer, has been working with you on these responses. And I'm curious, just from a process perspective, if you could just, the two, you could describe how you go from, okay, this proposed rule is released. It's usually released on a Friday around 4:30. And you have, say, 2 months to respond. How do you go from that moment to submitting ASN's response? Can we just start on a process level, and then we'll go through the substance of the response to the first rule you mentioned, and then how you see kind of the timeline and what the big issues are for the second proposed rule that you mentioned?
Absolutely. And I'm just going to say something really brief here to set it up, and then Lauren, I'll invite you to really kind of fill it out. Basically, this is a good example of one, because the ESRD PPS QIP rule, which deals with the whole ESRD benefit, is one that must be done every year and really regulates the entire program. So there are a number of issues that we have followed, ASN and other members of the kidney community, on a regular basis, things we've been advocating for, things that we've been asking for changes in, all things of that nature. So this is a very good example of one, because it's one that when it comes out, we generally have some idea of what we have asked for in the past and things that we are looking for. And Lauren is really taking the lead this year in kind of going through and trying to align those issues together and see what looked like it's stacking up or not. Lauren, you want to jump in?
Yeah, should I just do an overview of what was introduced in the PPS QIP, or how we kind of address it when it's released? Like, what's the process like?
Why don't you go for the second first, and then we'll get to the other.
Yeah, so as Todd mentioned, the ESRD PPS QIP, for people who aren't familiar with the acronyms, it's the End-Stage Renal Disease Prospective Payment Program and Quality Incentive Program. And that's typically released every year around July. In the past, it was usually released July 3rd, but this year, I guess we got a little bit lucky and it came out on June 29th at 4:30 p.m. And the process at ASN is, when we get word that this is going to be released, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare posts it on their website, and then we go into the Federal Register and read the proposed rule there. Usually we do like a quick skim of it, because these rules can be really lengthy. I think this one in particular is 330 pages, which is a lot. So then once we do like the preliminary check for anything major, we'll go back and look at it a lot more closely. And then we'll write up a memorandum or summary and send it over to our quality committee, which is the quality committee is the committee at ASN that deals with the ESRD PPS QIP. And we get feedback from the physicians that are on that committee about what they think personally about it, like how that impacts their practices and what they think, given their expertise dealing with that directly. And then after that, David and I will review those comments, draft a comment letter, and then we'll send it over to ASN's counsel, who they will also review what the quality committee and what we've written up for it, and then it will be approved and submitted to CMS. And usually the deadline for this is in August. I believe that the ESRD PPS QIP comment letters are due August 26th this year. So it's kind of a lengthy process, but I think this year is going to be a little bit lighter. Is there anything else you have to add to that, David?
No, I think you captured that process very well. What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I think you did as well. I guess the one thing I would add is that we do not sort of ASN as an organization doesn't exist on an island, so there is a broader community, and so there's both the kidney community and sort of kidney specific discussions, but then a lot of times in some of these proposed rules there will be other constituencies, and we'll try to make sure that we're aligned with all those constituencies, either inside the community or outside the community. And if we're not, if there's a disagreement on an issue, there's a fair amount of back and forth to see if there's a way that we can try to speak with one voice. And if we just ultimately disagree, how best to communicate back in a way that's productive. I think that's really the goal, is you want to provide, high quality, substantive, thoughtful comments back to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Well, what I'll do is I'm going to point out a couple of really big issues that I think are going to be kind of dominating everyone's comments, and then Lauren, you jump in as well, because I think there's some things that our listeners would know that we've been working on for quite some time, and one of them is going to be simply just what is the base rate for paying for dialysis for next year. And that is being proposed with a 1.6% increase. And while ASN is not necessarily always focused on the payment side of dialysis, we still have to pay attention to the fact that this does exist in a real world economy. And I think what we're seeing throughout the community and within our own membership is 1.6% is really anemic when you look at the inflation that's going on in the country and in healthcare. And I think probably in this space we're looking at about 7% inflation this year. So and people will calculate that differently. So if you think it's much higher, please don't come after me on that one, because there's a lot of ways to calculate it. But yes, a lot of people.
David, I have a quick question. I honestly don't know the answer to this, and I should. I know when we look at funding for research, say for the NIH, they use something called BirdPie, and BirdPie is an acronym for sort of biomedical research inflation index, something like that. Is there an equivalent for this type of inflation that they can benchmark against?
Yes, there is, and it's one of those things that we quite often don't talk about with everyone else, just because it'll make everybody a little bit crazy to listen to. But in this particular situation, what they do is they have what they call a market basket. Okay, and so the market basket is one in which they put in certain calculations for the market basket. And that includes calculations like, of most significance really here right now, is basically labor. Labor is one of the things that is a really major impact for your market basket. And you can also deal with capital assets. You can also deal with, there's several market baskets in several different programs within Medicare, and they all kind of are based on the kind of same things, but there really are certain costs and certain inflationary forces that are at play. And we've taken some of that out of the basket space, including the payments for innovation in drugs, which is TDAPA, and for the devices, which is Tiffany's. We can go through that in more detail in a minute. But that market basket gets kind of calculated, and that's how you get a calculation as to, and there's also an estimated growth in what expenses they expect to happen during that year. So there's some of that that's kind of based on what is currently happening, and some of that are economic expectations that Medicare makes. And so the market basket is calculated, and that is what really leads to the way in which they pick a payment structure. Okay, and that payment structure this year is coming out to be $269.99 per the base rate per episode of dialysis. And of course, we know there's add-ons and different things that can be done in that space, but that's about a $4.4 increase, $4.42 over last year. And it doesn't take a whole lot to figure out that inflation in the last year has way outstripped that. So that will be a problem. But yes, that is where you go to market basket, and we can always, if anybody wants to hear more or talk more about market basket, please email us at the policy section, and we will be more than happy to talk to you about it. But that's what kind of defines that. Does that make sense?
It does, and I realize I took you down a bit of a rabbit hole, but I do think it's important that there are these indicators, and that they do try to work within them. But clearly, that's not what's happening with this proposed rule. I guess before we move to our final branch of government,
I'll just say one thing. I think one of the criticisms here is that the system, as it's designed, doesn't have enough elasticity in it when you get into a situation like we're in now. And that market basket doesn't really reflect everything that it needs to at this time. And that's really a problem. So, because I hear you, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but that is really what's concerning people is, does the ESRD benefit really have long-term survivability when it's calculated like this?
And does the bundled payment help or hurt that, or is it neutral?
Oh, you just used the magic word, neutral. Congress requires these things all to be budget neutral. So that's the problem. You're not growing the pie. You're simply just, trying to arrange how much of the pieces you're growing. There are some additional monies that come into the system that are necessary, but for the most part, making it budget neutral is really a problem.
So before we move to our third and final branch of the government, I'm curious as to what else you, Lauren, the Quality Committee, are looking at in terms of this proposed rule, or what we should be paying attention to.
I think
Lauren?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think David's last comment actually is a perfect segue into the next thing that we're looking at on the regulatory end, and included with the 1.6 base payment rate adjustment. They're also proposing to add a pediatric transitional add-on payment adjustment, and there's a fun acronym for that called TPEAPA, and that's going to be a 30% payment increase for pediatric dialysis treatments, because CMS determined that having pediatric treatments tends to be a lot more expensive than regular adult dialysis treatments. So to account for that expense that facilities may face treating pediatric patients, they're going to increase their payment rate 30%. And that comes at the cost of, this all has to be budget neutral. So when you're adding on a 30% increase, it has to come from somewhere. So that's one of ASN's concerns as well. I could keep going, but David, if you'd like to add on what else we're looking at.
Well, I mean, we can get going, but I want to say about the pediatric one, we have been advocating for that for some time, and we do. And now that's 30% on what is currently in pediatric nephrology. So it's not 30% of the whole ESRD payment system, because it is much smaller. But we did want, and I think everyone would have preferred that it not be budget neutral, that there be new dollars put in. And that's a little bit of what the concern is. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, we'll come back, and you and I can come back and go over what exactly we ended up putting into our comment letter at a later date, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, so I'm kind of shifting now to our third and final branch of the government. I'm really struck that, the last couple weeks of June, particularly the week of the 26th, you had the Supreme Court issuing a series of very important and very sort of transformational decisions, ending with the SFFA decision on the 29th. You then mentioned, Lauren, that we had the proposed rule was released also on the evening of the 29th for the ESRD payment program and quality incentive program. You then have until sort of August to respond to that. And then, for the legislative branch, there's a lot happening the week of July 17th around transplant policy. So I think, despite what we just said about how important these landmark decisions have been and how important the responding to the proposed rules is, I would argue that this will be remembered as the summer of transplantation, particularly for what's happening at the legislative level. So, David, can you just give us a quick summary there in our last couple of minutes? And this is something, we'll come back to throughout the summer.
Sure. Well, we're going to have some other people back on to talk about this again. But basically, there is a movement to really modernize the OPTN process, the Organ Procurement Transplant Network process, and how that contract is given out, which does have a lot of impact. The administration has proposed some pretty significant changes about how they want to handle that this year as that contract comes up, and really kind of breaking it open and really making it much more focused on what patients really need, and particularly the transplant transparency that is lacking in the system right now for both nephrologists and for the kidney patient. But the catch is that is going to need some authorization by Congress. So the OPT and Modernization Act is being backed up by securing the U.S. Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network Act, which is a bill, one in the House and one in the Senate. And the House has already passed it in the Energy and Commerce Committee, which means it's pretty much clear to go to the House floor now. And the Senate is taking it up. That week, there's very likely to be, that we talked about, there'd be likely to be a hearing in the Senate on this, as well as the fact that ASN is bringing in some of its top transplant nephrologists and members of leadership on July 18th for a July 19th set of meetings on Capitol Hill with important members, particularly in the Senate, and to try to make sure that this does move on time. So we are going to have a very exciting week with members coming in and actually focusing on the issue on Capitol Hill. And then at the end of the week at HRSA, the Health Resources Services Administration that oversees transplant in a lot of ways, we're going to have a meeting there on the 21st of July, which is going to be a lot of input about how this process is going. Went through a lot there very fast. There's a lot of more details, but can go into that in a later podcast.
Yeah, I think just to emphasize 3 points that you made, one is that Congress is moving quickly in a bipartisan fashion and a bicameral fashion to consider these legislative proposals that they would like to have finalized and then signed by the president by the end of the summer, so that they can continue the progress on these changes to the current system. So I think that's one piece, and so there is a bit of a timing challenge there. I think the second piece is you mentioned that this is not just a congressional or legislative effort, that the executive branch through the Health Resources and Services Administration is also engaged and aligned, and they're trying to time their efforts with what Congress is doing. And so I think the real challenge here is going to be, can we get this done before the August recess? And Congress usually goes out for a couple of weeks in August and then comes back after Labor Day. And so there is the sort of the clock is ticking here on this one. David, I'll give you the final word about anything we've talked about, particularly this last issue.
Well, I'm going to say one thing that's very, very exciting. There's a lot happening in transplant. It's fantastic. And also our leaders are really engaged in all this. And I'm really so glad that Lauren has joined us this year so that I don't lose my mind on the ESRD PPS QIP by myself.
Well, I was thinking we should also, just given I didn't know the pediatric acronym that she mentioned, so I'm thinking we should just dedicate a one episode to sort of decoding the acronyms in nephrology and nephrology policy. So that'll be our challenge for the future.
That will be called a mini series.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, David, thank you, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.